Hello and welcome back to our next module as we continue our study of epistemology, the study of the nature of knowledge and how we gain it. We're going to return to a philosopher we've met before, Cardinal John Henry Newman, and his work, Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. While we've used this work previously to understand his argument for divine existence from conscience, we're actually going to delve into perhaps what is more of the heart of his work, which is understanding how we can assent to knowledge, or as he puts it, propositions of knowledge. And this is going to focus more so on how we can be sure of the knowledge that we have. So we have to remember that in Newman's epistemology, he was essentially looking at the epistemology of religion, which in other terms basically means that his understanding of how knowledge is made and how we can be sure of it will ultimately lead to a conversation on the divine. How can we be sure of God? That's how it led to his argument on conscience. We're going to focus kind of how he first gets to that understanding, because the way he gets to that understanding of God does say something about epistemology in general. He does engage in epistemology in getting to an epistemology of religion, put a different way. He's very similar to his contemporaries in the 20th century because he does root his epistemology in the necessity of experience. And he speaks of knowledge and epistemology in terms of propositions, which we've kind of talked about before in other modules, the difference between a priori and a posteriori propositions. A priori, those based on rational thought, and a posteriori, those based on experience. And so really what he's focusing on is not necessarily the creation of propositions, but rather, at least what we'll spend our time discussing today, is how can we assent to these propositions, whether they're notional in our minds or real that we can grasp, and how can we be certain about them? In other words, how can we be certain of the knowledge based on these propositions? So simply put, a proposition is a statement asserting a fact. And there's three kinds of propositions that Newman outlines: categorical, conditional, or interrogative. So interrogative propositions, simply put, are propositions put in the form of a question. Think of interrogative means question, and they can simply be answered with a yes or no. So an example, does free trade benefit the poor class? It's a proposition in the state of a question. There's conditional propositions, which are propositions that express a conclusion and are dependent or conditional on other propositions or conditions. So for example, free trade therefore benefits the poorer class. The word therefore assumes in that statement that there was other information shared before that sentence on which you can then conclude free trade therefore benefits the poor class. Think back to syllogisms, how there were two statements before the conclusion that the conclusion was dependent on. That last conclusion, we would say, is a conditional proposition that's conditional on the previous statements. And then a categorical proposition, which makes an assertion that does not depend on any conditions or other propositions. In other words, it stands alone. It's unconditional. Free trade does benefit the poorer class would be an example. You're making an absolute statement. Well, to any proposition, Newman is going to say that we might have, as humans, three mental responses. And these can all happen at the same time. It doesn't mean you're going to have all of these kind of mental responses to a proposition. It basically means that when you hear one of these statements of a fact, you usually respond with one of three ways. Either you doubt it, so you do not see your own way or what you believe to be true within that proposition, at least to a certain degree. You respond with an inference, which is to hold sufficient grounds that a proposition may, must, or should be the case. So in other words, an inference cannot stand alone by itself. It's conditional on other evidence, ideas, or propositions. So an example of an inference is the bag of apples is full. Okay, which bag of apples? Where is the bag of apples? All right, maybe I can infer by what the proposition you're making to me that the bag of apples is indeed full, but I need more information in order to assent to it, in order to be certain of it. And this leads to the third option of how we might respond, which is what Newman spends most of his time focusing on, which is assent, which is to hold, indeed, that the proposition is true. It is the complete opposite of doubt. So it is an unconditional assent to the proposition. So a better example of this would be the bag of apples on top of my dining room table is full of apples. I can assent to that because assents, as we'll see, are based in experience. If I can see the bag of apples on the dining room table, I know where it is, and you have told me that it's full, I can assent to that because I can see it, I can experience it as real, not necessarily as an idea. So to this end, we can think of the three responses in terms of a question or an interrogative proposition is an expression of doubt. A conclusion, a conditional proposition, is an expression of inference. And an assertion, a categorical proposition, is an expression of assent. So again, three propositions, interrogative, conditional, and categorical. And to these propositions, we may respond in one of three ways. Or, to be fair, as Newman would say, these can coexist in the mind. We can respond with doubt. I don't think it's true. Inference. It could be true or it should be true, but there's other information it's dependent on. Or an assent. Yes, I hold it to be true. So he focuses mainly on the idea of assent, what we can know to be true as opposed to an inference. It may be true and it could be true, but I need more information to move from an inference to actually assenting to it being true. Because inference leads to assent if certain conditions are later met, or doubt is a negative assent. But for us to gain true assent to knowledge, the assent must be unconditional. We cannot assent to a proposition without some intelligent apprehension of it. We'll discuss what apprehension means in a second. So there's two kinds of assents that Newman outlines in his work. The first is notional assent, and the second is real assent. Really, the difference is a notional assent is assent to a notional proposition. In other words, propositions that are held in the mind. They're notional, they're ideas. You might equate them more to a priori. Real assent talks about real assent to real propositions. In other words, things that are encountered in personal experience. You might equate them to a posteriori. By real, Newman is more referring to real things or thinginess that we can grasp. The bag of apples that is on top of my table that I can see, as opposed to the idea of a bag of apples. Well, it's hard to know if the idea of a bag of apples is full because it's an idea, as opposed to looking at the actual bag of apples on top of my table. So inasmuch as the proposition is more about an idea, theoretical, Newman's going to say we can really only assent to it as a notional assent. In order for us to make a real assent, it needs to be a thing. It needs to be real and can be experienced. So let's begin with notional assent. Notional assent is assent to a concept we have solely again in our mind. It's not rooted in concrete physical experience, but in abstract reason. Abstraction means it's basically in thought only. So if you've ever seen the Disney movie Inside Out, we have an image here on the right. There's a time when when the main characters, Joy, Sadness, and Bing Bong, are trying to get back to headquarters in this imagery of being in a girl's mind. And they go through this danger zone, which is basically this area of abstract thought. And once it turns out, they start to deconstruct and become more simpler versions and essentially abstract. So we have this image in the movie of the realness becoming less and less. They go two-dimensional, and then, well, they're blocky, then they become two-dimensional, and then they become just abstract colors. It's really kind of just really flowy and out there. There's no firmness to who they are anymore. That's what we mean by notional assent. It's not firm. It's not talking about an idea or a concept that's firm or real that we can grasp and measure. It's abstract. It's an idea. It can change. So the level of assent can't be that firm because what we're assenting to isn't that firm. Um, there may be enough to provoke someone to action around an idea, but it's not really a strong assent like a real assent because it's not real. In other words, you may be able to assent to an idea of doing good for someone, but then when you actually meet someone who's suffering and you realize that they need help, you might be more compelled to actually act because in the moment you see that they need help, as opposed to this idea of, well, there are people in the world that need help and I should probably help people. See the difference? One is notional and ideological. The other one is there's an immediate real need. I need to help. So you might assent much quicker. The fact that it's not as strong as real assent is rooted in the idea that human beings do not act solely with their brains. Remember, we're mind, body. Inferences tend to be notional propositions because there's more that we need. To make really an assent tends to be focused around real things. To infer something has a level of abstraction. In other words, you're drawing a conclusion, you're inferring a conclusion without having all the information. So you kind of have to supplement that with theory in your mind. Because notional propositions are abstract concepts, they can only be notionally apprehended. In other words, we may not come to a full understanding of them. So there's 5 types of notional assents that Newman outlines in his work. The first is profession. These are assents made upon habit and without reflection. He uses this line from his work, Grammar of Assent. When a man calls himself a Tory, someone who is a supporter of the British Empire, or a liberal as having been brought up as such. You could replace these terms with any term you'd like, but basically what he's getting at is when you say, I'm this, but you really haven't reflected on why you are. You hold it to be true maybe because you were brought up with that belief, but you really haven't ever accepted it for yourself. So you made assent to it in your mind without reflection. He calls this a profession. Credence. This is assent which we give to opinions or professed facts which are ever presenting themselves to us. It's basically things we take for granted. We may not have presumed them to be true. We may not have verified them to be true, but we presume them to be true. We kind of just take them for granted because we've never found an instance in our life when they're not true. That doesn't mean they're proven. We just take them on credence, kind of notionally. An opinion. This is an assent to proposition, not as true, but probably true. So we hold opinions to be true, but until they're verified, or we make a real assent to them through understanding, they don't move into the realm of truth. They're just held as an opinion. So an example is a collection of notions we happen to have, but don't have sufficient proof nor firm grasp of them. When we're challenged on them, we might back up a little bit. Presumptions. These are assents to what Newman calls first principles. First principles are propositions often accepted to be true, which you start with in reasoning about any particular subject matter. So in other words, they're like the beginning points in any kind of topic that need to be true in order for the topic to move forward. We presume that they're true in order for things to work. Speculation. Newman defines this as being mental sight or the contemplation of mental operations as opposed to experience, experiment, or sense. In other words, we form a theory without firm evidence. We speculate based on what little information we have of what probably is happening. We make, in other words, an assumption. We don't have firm evidence. Some of these you could probably tell, especially when it comes to opinion, presumption, and speculation, have a lot of overlap. What you could probably see in all 5 of these is that there's not a firmness of evidence or information or reflection on these ideas. They are just simply ideas. And so because they're only simply ideas, we can only assent to them to a certain degree. Notice we talk about opinion, not truth. We talk about speculation, not certainty. So this is really as far as a notional assent can be. We can assent to it being true, but really only to a certain degree. We can never have certainty. And that's going to be one of the main differences between notional and real assents. You can only really have certainty about real assents. Notional assents, you can assent to it to a certain degree, but not completely. And this is where we get to real assents. And as you could probably already tell, real assents to Newman is the stronger of the assents. It's rooted in concrete experience, whereas notional assents are rooted in abstract thought and ideas, and us thinking about ideas. Real assent doesn't necessarily impel us to act on something, but it does compel us to act on something more than notional assent does. Remember the idea of I should help homeless individuals, as opposed to seeing a homeless individual who asks for our help right in front of us. We're probably going to be more compelled to act in that instance than just thinking about I should probably help people. And we assent notionally to the fact that, yeah, that's probably a good thing to do, but it may not ever compel us to action. We may not ever get around to doing it, because assent to a notional assent is not that strong. When we're confronted with someone in front of us asking for help, that when we assent is stronger because it's a real-time need. Real assent therefore stimulates our passions or emotions more because we're in the moment, we're experiencing the situation. Since they have a power to penetrate more deeply into ourselves, since they're rooted in an experience involving our whole selves rather than just being rooted in our minds. So again, Newman and his contemporaries agree in the importance of experience, real experience in creating knowledge. In other words, while he doesn't deny that we can assent to theoretical knowledge, he's going to agree that experiential knowledge, a posteriori propositions, are really where we can have knowledge that is certain. And so we can have knowledge that is notional, but to be certain of it, to be certain of the knowledge that we have, it needs to be real. It needs to be rooted in experience. Real assent can be concretely apprehended or be made because real propositions are really experienced. So again, we can make a real assent because it's based in real experience. So this gets to the idea of apprehension versus understanding. So we've seen the term apprehension thrown out there a couple of times, where we can make real or notional assents, but there's a difference between apprehension and understanding. So when we talk about understanding a notion or understanding something to be real, it might be different than apprehending it to be real or notional. Apprehension is simply an intelligent acceptance of an idea or of the fact which a proposition expresses or pronounces or it enunciates. Understanding is to fully grasp or comprehend a proposition. So if we understand something, we fully grasp the proposition, the statement of the fact. To apprehend it is we have a working acceptance of it. We have enough information to apprehend it, but we don't fully understand that. So similarly, we can make a real or notional apprehension based on whether or not the proposition is real or notional. So think of it this way. In terms of propositions, we might have an apprehension of them. In other words, we have enough intelligence about it to grasp some of it, or we can have an understanding of it. We can fully grasp it. And in each case, we can have a real or notional assent to an apprehension or understanding based on whether or not the proposition in play is a real proposition based in experience or a notional proposition based in ideas. So then what's the difference between assent and certainty? Basically in the vernacular, when people are speaking, these terms tend to be used interchangeably, or really no distinction is made between making an assent to a proposition and being certain of it. But Newman makes a slight distinction. He says certitude is an assent that you're conscious of. Assent may be conscious or unconscious. An unconscious assent he would call a simple assent. So that basically means that all certitudes are assents, but not all assents are certitude. So when we talk about being certain about a proposition or a piece of knowledge, we're talking about even a more elevated kind of assent. So an unreflected assent is not genuine assent. Certitude is a reflected assent. So how can we be certain of a proposition? How can we be certain of assent? It's when we've been able to actually think about it, reflect on it, weigh it to be true. It goes all the way back to Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. Uh, he would agree with Newman on this, in the sense that if we just have an unreflected life, we can only assent to things at best notionally. But if we want to make a real assent to to the information in our lives, the knowledge we've gained, if we want to be certain about what is true, we have to think. We have to reflect on that information. A simple assent, in other words, an assent we might make even unconsciously, need not be notional, but what we call certitude must be notional. In other words, we will have to have thought about what exactly we believe to be true. Assents may change, but certitude endures. So it's an elevated version of making an assent. So we may make an assent notionally or real, depending on whether or not the proposition is just an abstract idea or a real experience. And because of that, our assent to those notions or to those experiences might change. It's going to be stronger in the real, but especially might change for a notional assent. But when we become certain in our assent, that endures. And so Newman would say that religion would require a certainty, it would require certitude. Certitude is directed towards particular propositions. It does not require infallibility. Certitude, therefore, can be understood as simply an assent with a higher level of probability. And from here, it is an act of recognition as proposition is true. So again, we may have doubt when we hear a piece of knowledge, proposition. We might infer what is true about that proposition, but we need more information. Then we might assent to that information, that proposition. But even on top of the assent, there's a certain level of certitude that we can get to. And that's what we're seeking, is certainty. How do we know that we can be certain of the knowledge that we have? And for Newman, it's basically going to entail that we have enough information to be able to assent to it, and then can reflect on it to be certain about it. How do we get from assent to certitude? Well, he talks about the illative sense. The illative sense is a sense that we have, a faculty, if you will, in which we work through all the data. Again, we reflect, that process of reflecting to move from assent to certitude. Newman would call that we're using our illative sense to reflect on and to work through all the data of our real experience in order to apprehend an assent to the truth. The illative sense has often been described as like common sense, or our sense of beauty and wonder. It's the power of judging and concluding. So another way of put it is, how do we move from assent to certitude? We use our illative sense to reflect on and judge the information we have of the proposition to then be certain about it. It is ratiocinative, or in other words, it's based on exact thinking, which is a faculty, the ratiocinative faculty, common to all humans. Again, a fancy way of saying common sense. It's our ability to reason. Again, Newman's going to focus on the necessity of us using human reason to test the knowledge we have, to be able to assent to it, and then using our illative sense, be certain of it. So the illative sense allows for an assent according to probability that allows us to be certain. In other words, the illative sense is what allows us to be certain in our assent. So in terms of religion, because like I said, Newman focuses on epistemology of religion. He ultimately leads then, well, how can we know, how can we assent to religion and God? And he really talks about that there's two ways. The first type of knowledge is from our natural way of being in the world, and the second is dependent on God revealing something to us and our receiving of it. And so he calls these two ways natural religion and revealed religion. Natural religion, we may receive knowledge of a natural theology from our individual minds, the voice of mankind generally, such as a societal conscience, and through the world. You might think of this as what Aquinas called the natural law. The most authoritative of these knowledge from our mind is from our mind or our experiences. This would include conscience. There's then also revealed religion, which is the revelation we receive directly from God. And it's contingent on God entering into human history. Only because of this, and only because of his presence in human history, such as the incarnation in Jesus, can we actually know this information. So it's a belief in revelation is dependent on the belief of the natural, We first believe in history to believe that God reveals through history. In other words, we have to believe that this world is not a dream, as Descartes might put it, but that it actually exists first in order for God to be able to physically enter into it. So simply put, the way that we then can assent to knowledge as it pertains to religion is we may come to it, in a sense, notionally or experientially through our experience of the world around us, the natural law, which Newman calls natural religion, or directly from God himself, what we call revealed religion, or what we call today divine revelation. So again, remember that for Newman, the focus is on how can we be certain of knowledge. Knowledge puts forth itself as propositions. There are different kinds of propositions, and we can have different responses to these propositions. Doubt, inference, or assent. Assent can be notional or real, based on if it's just an idea, or if it's actually based in experience. And ultimately, to move from just having assent to being certain about a proposition, we need to use our illative sense to reflect on the information to then be certain